So we're going to sculpt the eye. I'm making a study, and this is a work-along speed video, so it is pretty much just me working, and you can follow along. I want my piece of clay to be about 1 inch thick, or in this case it's about 2 fingers, so that I have a good depth for the first step. Well, the second step. So the first step is actually kind of to draw out roughly where the eye is. You do want to include a little more detail of the facial features than you would in another study like the nose or the mouth, because these help orient the eye. So I do want to draw out where the eyeball is and the nose. So now my next step is to actually kind of hollow out this hole, and this is the eye socket. So the eye socket holds the eyeball, so that's why you need a thicker piece of clay, and it is much larger than the actual eye itself, so keep that in mind. So from here, I'm actually going to add a little bit of the eyebrow, and that helps me see dimension. It helps create more dimension. Eyes often look really awkward when you don't have any dimension around them. So that's why we're going to focus a little more on sculpting a little more of the face in general. So this is a kind of tapered sort of teardrop shape piece, and I'm going to attach that with the taper towards the center of the face. So I'm making, if it was your face, and it would be your left eye, right? If you're looking at somebody else, it's what would be on the right side of the person you were facing. So I'm scoring and adding some water to create slip, because this is water-based clay, and if you're making a study like this where you wouldn't actually, I'm not actually going to keep and fire this, but if you are firing it, you do need to score and slip things together, and so I find that it's just a great habit to get into, even if you're not going to keep it, because it just helps ensure that your pieces are strong and adhered together, and you know, you don't forget it later at a critical point. So I'm going to blend this together. Again, this is the brow ridge, and I'm going to kind of think about the planes of the brow. Where is the peak of it, right? And especially when I'm sculpting the face, I find that I actually end up feeling my facial features a lot more. I've mentioned this in my other videos. When you're beginning sculpting things like from realism, it's best to sculpt from what you're familiar with, which is generally yourself, because you're right there, right? And when you're sculpting by feel, right, you feel the clay, it often can be helpful to then feel what that dimension is like on your actual face. Of course, when you're working with clay, this means your face might get a little messy, so just a heads up on that. I also kind of marked out where I might see like the groove or a wrinkle. So now I need to actually create the eyeball. So I'm just going to create a ball of clay, and I want to check before I commit to it the dimension. It does need to stick out a little bit, and so that one is a little bit too shallow, so I'm going to add a little bit of clay to that. So you can see here, if I look at it from the side, there's no eyeball at all sticking out. Be careful though that you're not giving it a really bulging eyeball either. All right, so get it nice and round. Score. Add a little water, and press down, but being very careful when you press that you're not losing the roundness of that eyeball. All right, so you have to treat this very gently. So now I need to think about my upper and lower eyelids, and I always start with the lower lid, and I'm rolling out a piece of clay that's about pinky thickness. Of course, this does depend on how big of an eye you're sculpting, so I'm sculpting something slightly larger than real life or at real life. And I flatten my coil a little bit, just by either tapping it on the table, using my thumbs, pinching it perhaps, a combination. And I'm going to take a little ball of clay, create 2 balls of clay actually, and I'm going to put those in the corner of the eye, and that creates that more oval shaped eye. So it kind of implies like the tear ducts and the muscles underneath. Really pay attention to placement, because where is that located in your eye? Is it straight across the middle? Is it one slightly lower or higher than the other? Those features help define the person that you're sculpting, right? Where those things sit on the eye of that individual. So I'm going to thin out that edge of the eye. And so I'm starting with the lower lid, because generally speaking, eyelids, the lower lid sits underneath the upper lid. And so it's a little shorter, and so it's easier to, it makes more sense to add it first, right? You're kind of creating it in the same way that it would actually sit on an actual face. So I'm scoring around both the upper and lower areas because I know I'm going to need to do it anyway, so I might as well get it all done now. Careful to not score the eyeball itself. All right, so I do have a fairly deep kind of depression kind of cavity here, so I am going to have to think about how I place it, how it's going to maybe tuck in or not, right? So you can see here, do I need to press it in a little bit to still get it to fill in that gap, and also take advantage of that gap to show the indentation of the eye socket. If you feel your eye and where your eye, the lower eye socket is, you can feel that bone and where that socket actually sits. So I'm going to kind of press that in there. And using my wooden modeling tool, I'm just thinking about this, lower portion here. And I can kind of press up against the eyeball to get that lid to stick on there. And then I'm going to make the upper lid. So I'm certainly not finishing the lower lid before I start the upper. I'm just kind of laying it in place. So same thing, I'm rolling out my coil of clay, I'm flattening it a little bit so that I can have that sort of thinned out edge of the lid. I'm using sometimes a little bit of water as I smooth it to get it nice and thinned down. Sometimes when I do this it does curve, so think about what direction it's curving. And so when I'm making this upper lid, I also want to think about the peak of the upper lid, which tends to be about 1/3 of the way in from the corner. And that's where it peaks up. But of course, generally speaking, that is not something that happens always. Now, notice when I place that down, it wants to tuck in. So I'm actually going to need to kind of press that inward at this angle. You can see there where it kind of fits underneath that brow ridge so that I get that folded, kind of tucked in look that you would get in a real lid, right? The lid is recessed behind or, inside of that brow ridge. So I'm going to take my wooden modeling tool and use the curved end of it, make sure there's not clay all over it, and use that to press that lid into the kind of crease area. So again, I'm being careful not to disturb the detail of it overlaying the eyeball, but I still need to blend it in to the rest of the skin folds and areas. So don't forget to check side view, right? We are thinking about this as a three-dimensional piece, even though it's not fully three-dimensional as a flat kind of study. We do want to think about the point of view from the side, because if we're thinking about this as practice for applying to a full-size piece at one point, at any point, then you do need to be familiar with the volume and the dimensionality of the entire face. So lots of little adjustments. I felt like the lower eyelid needed to tuck under the upper one a little bit, so I used the tool to do that. So lots of looking and refining in little incremental stages. Don't be afraid to adjust. I have started this over. This is not the first eyeball I've sculpted in kind of creating this video, so it is certainly not something that you can always expect to get right the first time around. Sometimes you need to think about, is it worth fiddling with, or do we start over? So it is possible to sculpt under the eyelid, but you have to just be super careful that you don't scratch the eyeball. It starts to get really hard to fix that and still maintain the shape of the lid. But you can see here I have this really pointed piece of plastic. This is actually old, like plastic strapping But it's basically just kind of some firm plastic that I've cut into a point, and so I can use that to get into some fine areas and then come back in sometimes with my other tools as needed. Part of the trick to using your tools and using them well is just trying them out a lot of times and in different ways. And I don't always do that on an actual piece. I'm sometimes doing that on a piece of clay. So right now I'm sketching out sort of like where wrinkles might be, where folds or like, pieces of skin might be, where the bone ridges are. So just starting to map out further out from the eye where that happens, because that will tell me where I need to either carve or add in pieces of clay. At this stage, I want to start thinking about some more dimension around the outside of the eye. So I'm starting to think about, the folds underneath the eye, or it could also be the actual eye socket, right? So just starting to think about where we're going to see the three-dimensionality. I find that with eyes in particular, even if I'm sculpting a study, right, a practice piece of one facial feature, it does help to really build up around it so that they're not floating in space. And you might have to hold things at a slightly different angle to get into different places. That's the convenient thing about a study as opposed to, say, a full-on bust or figure sculpture, which are harder to work around different angles and everything. So I just felt like I needed to add a little more to the brow bone up here, so just adding a bit of clay. Like, what angle is that brow bone at? How far out does it protrude? How, exaggerated or subtle is that? How deep are the folds or the overhang of that brow? So those are all questions that you should ask yourself as you're sculpting this eye. It can be fairly generic if it's a study, but again, the more you think about the specificity compared to your model, whether it's yourself or somebody else, the more you're going to create a specific individual. So here I'm going to add a little bit of clay to where the nose goes, because like I just mentioned, adding those details really does help kind of anchor the nose, the eye, even as a study. So even though we're working on a flat backing, we do need to think about the three-dimensionality. So check out your piece from the side and see, is it, does it start to get some dimensionality, some 3D aspects to it? Could you get more of, say, a cheekbone or a brow ridge? So I'm feeling like maybe a cheekbone right here could be helpful to define the face a little bit. So I don't know the exact shape I want, I just know the location that I need to build up. So I'm going to score a little piece of clay and then just kind of shape it and mold it into place. And you can see me pausing, and I'm touching my cheekbone to kind of see what that feels like, and then going back to my piece. And this is a high point cheekbone. Like I don't actually have that here. This is just roughing it in. So I need to add some clay at the bottom and everything. So a lot of the times when you're first getting these components on, they're really exaggerated. And that's partly because they're unfinished and partly because it just helps you see what areas you're working on. So here you can see me adding some clay to soften that cheekbone edge, right? Checking at it from different points of view. All right, so I might want to use my brush a little bit now to start to get into the finer details. I've gotten it damp and I've blotted off all the excess water. And as I'm going, I realize there's still some clay in there that I really need to push out of there before I get into more finer details. So I find that as I start to smooth things, that's often where I'll notice where I need to work on something. So it's not a matter of, just smoothing at this stage. It's a matter of smoothing and then realizing, okay, well, here's another area I need to work on, and then going back in with other tools, and then coming back to smoothing. So it's this back and forth kind of dance between, one stage and the next. You can also press down on the clay in some areas to kind of press, the brow upwards or downwards. So for the actual pupil and iris, you will want to create, actually, unless you're going to add color, the traditional way to create this is actually by indenting or carving out where the pupil and iris go. So I'm just kind of marking out where that might be, thinking about like what direction is this person looking in. This is a little bit too small of an eye to use my loop tool like this. So there's a few options, but if you have something larger, maybe you can carve it out with this. And the thing here is if you have a darker eye, like a dark brown eye, then you want to carve it more deeply because the shadow that creates gives the impression of a darker eye. If you have a lighter eye, like a pale green or blue or something, then make it more shallow, and that lighter shadow is going to imply the lighter color. Oftentimes you can find the back of a tool will work really well for creating the correct indentation for the eye. So look around and see, and test it out on a piece of clay before you commit. I definitely did that prior to this example here. And then it will push up some clay though, so you need to perhaps smooth that down as you have created it. So at this point I've pretty firmly established my eye itself, and so now I could call it a day. I would consider this a pretty finished eye study, right? It's not fully refined and like a done sculpture perhaps, but now I'm just adding more details like the texture of the eyebrows and the actual hair on there perhaps, and some more dimension to the sides of the face around it, and cleaning it up a little bit.